The biker's creed is live to ride, but many of us aren't living that long, and the rest of us are definitely being taken for a ride. Vulnerable road users are those who have less crash protection than the occupants of motor vehicles, and therefore have a higher risk of being injured or killed. This of course includes cyclists and motorcyclists, but with all the focus on making cycling safer, they must be way more vulnerable than motorcyclists, especially compared with this bloke. But are they? Using motor vehicle fatalities as the baseline, drivers suffer 5 deaths per 100,000 motorists per year. Motorcyclists are being killed at a rate of 27 per 100,000 riders per year, which is over 5 times higher, confirming their vulnerability. So in comparison, you'd think cyclists must have an horrendous fatality rate to warrant the extra hundreds of millions being spent in funding and infrastructure in an effort to keep them safe. Try 1 cyclist per 100,000 riders per year. Yep, according to the statistics, it's actually 5 times safer to ride a push bike than it is to drive a car. And of course, 27 times safer than riding a motorcycle. Now, for the record, I'm all for keeping cyclists safe. Well, I used to be one when I was a kid. I just naturally progressed to motorcycles when I grew up. Now, I'm just confused with the funding and want to know why there's such a huge government and media focus on cycling safety, while motorcyclists are dropping like flies in comparison. And with any crumbs we do get thrown our way, there's a notable bias. Pretty much all motorcycling safety initiatives are aimed at the rider and or the bike. For example, tougher licensing and engine size restrictions, and the soon-to-be legislated compulsory ABS on all new bikes sold. And the marvellously imaginative initiative of having the police pay closer attention to us. Yeah, cheers for that. But the vast majority of cycling safety initiatives impose restrictions on everyone else but the cyclists themselves. In fact, the one initiative where cyclists were legislated to take responsibility for their own safety was in 1992, when it became compulsory for cyclists to wear helmets. But this intrusion resulted in a significant drop in cycling numbers. Now, this setback must have spooked the powers that be who are trying to encourage cycling, as they've since done little to put the onus on cyclists for their own safety since, and in the process seemingly appeasing their every little whim. Road cyclists especially have taken advantage of this to the point of becoming spoiled brats. Now, you may think I'm being a bit harsh, but just take a look at this stat. Although less than half of all weekly cyclists are over 18, they represent 94% of cycling fatalities. Now, how do you rationalise that without assuming that adult cyclists have more of a propensity to expose themselves to risk than children do? And it's not from a lack of others trying to keep them safe, as in the past decade or so there's been over $500 million spent on cycling networks, but even when these purpose-built cycle paths run parallel with the roads, many cyclists will ignore this safe option and ride on the road. But instead of legislating that cyclists must use cycle paths where available, governments and councils just carve up the roads to build bike lanes, and also allow cyclists to ride in transit lanes and bus lanes and breakdown lanes. Not because they're safer than cycle paths, but because it's a marginally safer option for those cyclists who simply refuse to use cycle paths. The next bizarre concession is that cyclists are allowed to ride 2 abreast. Why? It can't be a safer option than riding single file, as it puts one cyclist more on the path of following traffic, which surely gives a rise in the potential of being hit from behind. But instead of forcing cyclists to minimise the risk to themselves by foregoing the need to travel side by side to have a little chat, the legislators instead put the onus on every other road user by imposing a minimum distance of 1 metre when trying to go around them. I mean, fair dinkum, could you imagine that concession given to any other road user? Can you see the sense of entitlement I'm getting at? Well then, how about cyclists now being allowed to ride on footpaths and pedestrian crossings instead of walking their bikes? Not because it's safer, as it actually puts them and pedestrians more at risk. No, it's just more convenient for the cyclist. That's it. There's no other reason. And that's not the end of it. Cyclists want more concessions. There's a push for 30km speed limits in some cities, and I kid you not, a push for legislation that automatically assumes the motorist is at fault when there's a collision between them and a cyclist, with the burden of proof on the driver. Now, this proposal has been forwarded in response to the fact that the vast majority of cyclist collisions involve motor vehicles. Now, I don't want to sound like I have a doctorate in the bleeding obvious, but guess what the vast majority of truck collisions are with? Motor vehicles. Guess what the vast majority of bus collisions are with? Motor vehicles. Guess what the vast majority of motorcycle collisions are with? Motor vehicles. And see if you can guess what the vast majority of motor vehicle collisions are with. That's right, other motor vehicles. You see, when you're right on a road where the vast majority of road users are motor vehicles, what do you expect the vast majority of the collisions will be with? Fucking water buffalo?